Thank you all for coming, and I will throw it over to Julie. Have a great night, everyone.
Great, thank you so much. On behalf of the Women of Beth Israel, I would like to welcome all of you to tonight's event, Delicious History, Jewish Cookbooks Past, Present, and Future. And just in time for Rosh Hashanah, our featured guest tonight is Leah Koenig. Leah Koenig is the author of 6 cookbooks, including the Jewish Cookbook, Faden, 2019, a 400-plus recipe collection of Jewish dishes from around the globe, and Modern Jewish Cooking, published by the Chronicle in 2015. Her writing and recipes have also appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Epicurious, Food 52, Departures, and Tablet, among other publications. In addition to writing, Leah leads cooking demonstrations and workshops around the country, and now via Zoom. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband and 2 children. And now I'll turn it over to Leah.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Eileen. It's a pleasure to be here, and you may be able to see out the window that it is dark here because I'm in New York, so it's 10:35. So the real excitement of tonight will be to see if I can keep my eyes open. No, I'm just joking. It's a pleasure to be here, and as Julie mentioned, I write cookbooks, so it means I actually also own a lot of cookbooks and think all the time about cookbooks and collect them. So I don't have the thousands and thousands of books that real cookbook collectors have, but I'm working my way up, and I read them like textbooks. I read them like literature, and I find the history of Jewish cookbooks to be particularly fascinating, American Jewish cookbooks, I should say. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the history and kind of how they've changed over time. So I wanted to start, I'm actually going to share my screen. I wanted to start with a quote from one of the most amazing Jewish cookbook authors out there, Claudia Rodin. She wrote the Book of Jewish Food and many, many, many other wonderful cookbooks, both Jewishly focused and not. She was born in Egypt, so she's an Egyptian Jew, and she moved to London when she was in her teens. She's amazing. I won't talk too much about her until a little bit later, but she has this wonderful quote from one of her books that says, "Every cuisine tells a story. Jewish food tells the story of an uprooted, migrating people and their vanished worlds." So I just wanted to kind of hold that quote in our minds while we're talking about Jewish cookbooks tonight, because really at their heart, Jewish cookbooks are about capturing worlds as they're either happening or vanishing, and that is the story of Jewish cuisine. So let's start in the late 19th and mid 20th century. The very first Jewish cookbook, some of you probably have copies of this that were passed down to you for generations. The very, very first one was the book on the right of your screen. It's called Mrs. Esther Levy's Jewish Cookery Book. And then it has this amazingly long title, Principles of Economy, Adapted for Jewish Housekeepers, blah, 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 medicinal recipes. It goes on and on and on. When you think about it, what passes for a cookbook cover today, it's a little bit hilarious. But so that book was published in 1871 and was the very first American Jewish cookbook. And right next to it is a book called Aunt Babette's Cookbook. And I also love how cookbook is 2 words, the cookbook. I don't know at what point the word got squished together. But this one was published in 1909, and it has a similarly very long and official title. So I wanted to start here because when you're thinking about what role Jewish cookbooks played in Jewish life, in Jewish culture in America, cookbooks are actually a really great place to kind of to look. So these first cookbooks, there were recipes in them, of course. There were lots of recipes, actually, hundreds and hundreds in some cases, but they were so much more than just recipes. They were really instructional manuals. So as I wrote, there's information about how to set a proper table, how to wash dishes, how to, clean vegetables properly. So there's really a lot of home economic, scientific almost wisdom in these books. And to jump down, there's also a lot about health and sanitation. And there's a reason for this. A lot of these books were geared towards the Eastern European Jews who came to America in the 1880s through the 1920s. So, and they were often written by German Jews who had come, German Jewish women who had come earlier on, and were part of sort of an upper class and kind of fancied themselves to be teachers to the you know, kind of more homely Eastern European Jews who came a generation later. There's a lot of socioeconomic stuff there and a lot of, you know, class stuff going on. But, you know, these books were really seen as a way of acculturating and Americanizing these new immigrants to America. So they focused on recipes, but they were also about so much more. They also did pass on tradition. So there were recipes for the holidays and recipes, you know, for a young Jewish bride, because that was really the main audience for these books was someone who was getting married and starting a family and starting a home. And so that would be a time when they would get a book, which still happens today, but Jewish cookbooks have broader audiences than they did back then. But the kosher laws, interestingly, were sometimes secondary. And so I have a copy here of another one of the books that kind of falls into this category. I'm sure many of you know it and have it. This is the Settlement Cookbook. My mom, who's on the call tonight, her mom, had a copy of it that I remember thumbing through when I was a kid. This is a you know, kind of up-to-date version of it, but it was originally published in 1903, so right in the same time. And to give you a sense of this book and how it kind of fit in, it was written in 1901, and it had 1901, and it had 40 editions, and there were over 2 million copies of this sold. And if you compare that to other large cookbooks, one of the next largest selling cookbooks is Mastering the Art of French Cooking by Julia Child. That book sold 1.5 million copies over time. So this actually has sold more than Mastering the Art of French Cooking, which is kind of incredible to think about. And it was created by a woman named Lizzie Black-Kander, who was a German Jew and was very, very much, she ran houses, and there was sort of like instructional houses to literally, you know, bring the Eastern European Jewish immigrants kind of up the learning curve of American Jewish life through food, through domesticity, through running a household. So this was very much one of those books. And it's just incredible to me how far-reaching it is. I mean, I don't think people really necessarily use it today so much. I could be wrong. There probably are people who still do, but it's definitely something that people pass on generation to generation. The other book I wanted to mention, I think when people were holding up copies of their favorite Jewish cookbooks earlier, right before we started the conversation, and I think I saw this one. It's definitely one that my mom also had, and it's called A Treasure for My Daughter. I don't have it next to me, but so this book was written in 1950, and it was kind of in the same realm of these books, but it was written a little bit later by the Hadassah, I believe the Montreal Hadassah, and it's a little bit different, and then it's a conversation between a Jewish mother and her daughter, and at the beginning of every chapter, there will be sort of a dialogue between the mother and the daughter, where the mother's like, you know, Hadassah, or I think her name is Hadassah in the book, like, Passover is coming up, and so let's talk about the proper order of the Seder. So it's got a much more sweet, maternal, loving tone rather than an instructional kind of cold tone. So I think that's a little bit of, you see a little bit of a shift happening there. So these are the books, and this was sort of the role that that Jewish books and cookbooks played in the early 20th century and late 19th century. And so the next group. I will say, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the comments, chat them into the comments section, or I think there's actually even a Q&A box. So either one of those, and we'll make time for them for sure. So I won't miss any of that, I promise. Okay, so flash forward 50 years from the 1950s, and you're starting to get into the later 20th century and kind of the cusp of the 21st century. And you really start to see a change happening in Jewish cookbooks. And to me, it's a really exciting change. So there's sort of a few different things happening, and they're all happening for the same reason, which is the Jewish community at this point has existed in America for a generation or two, or even beginning to be 3. And there's a certain comfort and confidence that comes with that, right? So, you know, the early Jews who came were figuring out how to become Americans, how to acculturate, how to really kind of live in this new country. But by this time, you're starting to see a little bit more familiarity and comfort, and that gives Jewish cookbook authors an opportunity to play and to research and to kind of see Jewish food in a different way. And you see that reflected in the books of this period. And so you see a couple of recurring themes. The first kind of major chunk of Jewish cookbooks from this period, the kind of, I would say 1960s through the 1990s or 2000. The first is you start to see Jewish culinary anthropology books. So the big names of these books are obviously Joan Nathan, who is still making wonderful cookbooks today, and is an absolute role model of mine. All of these people are. Gil Marks, who passed away about 8 years ago, but put out a collection of wonderful Jewish books, and Claudia Rodin, who I mentioned earlier. So the books I'm talking about, if you're looking on the left of your screen, you see The Book of Jewish Food by Claudia Rodin, Jewish Cooking in America by Joan Nathan, and The World of Jewish Cooking by Gil Marks. This is just a snippet of what they created, but the shift that you see happening is they are saying, okay, we want to know what Jewish food is like around the world, right? We have this lived American Jewish experience, and we have the foods that we eat, the kugels and the briskets and the matzo ball soup and the challah and all of those things, but we want to actually dig deeper and look globally, which is really a radical idea for American Jews, to really look outside of what is happening in our kind of mostly Ashkenazi community. I believe it's still, America's Jewish population is still 75-ish% Ashkenazi. There are obviously other communities as well, but to really kind of dig into the culture and the history and the stories behind the food, these are the 3 people who I would say did the most to make that happen, and are in some cases continuing to make that happen. So that is one exciting thing. And I will say, as sort of this next generation of Jewish food writers, I look to them as my role models, because they did and continue to do amazing scholarship on that front. So the next thing you're seeing in this time period is an emergence of what I would call trendy or gourmet kosher. So this, oops, sorry, give me one second. I had a Zoom moment. Okay, so what you're also starting to see is people who are saying, okay, I keep kosher, or my family keeps kosher, but I don't want to eat just Jewish food. I don't want to have only have blintzes and only have latkes and only have, kind of the traditional Jewish food. I want to eat what my American neighbors are eating. And so you start to see cookbooks during this time period really speak to that. And, in the 1980s and 90s, you started to see an emergence of interest in low-fat cooking or in gourmet cooking. And so you start to see those things reflected in Jewish cookbooks as well. And there's many, many examples of that type of cookbook. And the other, and I would say it's different than the Jewish culinary anthropology books, which are really focused on culture. And these books are more focused on, you know, taking Thai cuisine, taking Mexican cuisine, and not saying these are Jewish cuisines, but saying we can adapt those foods for the kosher diet. So you can see the difference between those two types of books. The third is the community cookbook. These go back before the late 20th century, but I feel like they kind of had their heyday in like the 60s and 70s. I have a whole bunch of those that people have given me over time. You know them, you have them. There's the spiral bound books. You've probably, offered recipes to them before or are in community cookbooks. But they're books that are put out by Hadassah or by local synagogue chapters or, other organizations. And they really capture what one particular community is eating. So they're wonderful books to have, and they really show kind of these little microcosms of the Jewish food world across the country. So whenever I see one of those at like a used bookstore, I snatch it up because I want to see like what someone was making in San Diego or what someone was making in Boston, and kind of how those Jewish diets differ. And then the fourth book during this time period that really kind of emerged is what I call either the humorous Jewish books, and then there's also some outliers. So I wanted to show you, someone held up the French kosher cookbook. I have another book in that same series called the Chinese kosher cookbook, written by Ruth and Bob Grossman. And really, it's not the most PC book. I don't even want to read some of the names of the titles of the dishes because I don't think they're appropriate anymore, but I wanted to bring it because this book really captured a moment in time where New York Jews and Jews across the country, but specifically in New York, had a real affinity for Chinese cooking. That's a different topic that we can talk about in another conversation as to why that happened, but we all have kind of, gone out to Chinese food on Christmas, or had family that would keep kosher at home, but would go out to the Chinese restaurant and eat pork because it was minced really small and you couldn't see it anymore. And so, we've all heard or had experiences like that. So this book really kind of captures that moment, but it kind of is an outlier from other books. Another one that kind of falls into that category, I don't know if you can see this, is the Kosher Creole Cookbook. So this was written by a woman named Mildred Covert, who I actually got to meet about 15 years ago. She's since passed on. But she lived in New Orleans and saw all the amazing and very not kosher cooking going on in her community. So, crawfish and, gumbo and all of these wonderful dishes. And so she took it upon herself to find ways to make those dishes kosher. So I guess she sort of falls into the category of the Helen Nash and the Fay Levy book of taking cuisines and making them kosher. But it's just such a charming, sweet book. I love, there's like a jazz trumpet player and if you can see the cover, a jazz trumpet player and then like a clarinetist from a klezmer band. I think it's such a charming and sweet book. Okay, so now we're kind of gonna move, and I wanna leave time for questions, so I'm just gonna keep moving through. I want to move into what I call sort of the contemporary period. So this is, I would say, from 2000 until today. In my head, 2000 is still like 5 years ago, but it's, we're in the 2020s now. So this is a chunk of time that we can talk about. And there's really 4 primary categories of Jewish cookbooks that I see today. And it really, again, reflects what I would say is sort of larger information about kind of how Jews see themselves in the world and how we kind of see our community. So the first category, I'm going to show you some examples of them in a second, but the first is kind of a continuation of that gourmet or healthy kosher. So taking cuisines that aren't necessarily Jewish cuisine and kosherizing them, making them kosher, making them accessible to the kosher palate. The second one is modern takes on Jewish cuisine. So I'm making a distinction between kosher cuisine and Jewish cuisine. So Jewish cuisine is things that you would recognize as a Jewish dish, and finding ways to modernize them. I happen to write a book called Modern Jewish Cooking in 2015, so that I'll show you a cover of that in a second. That would be an example, but there's many, many other books that do that. The third would be modern Middle Eastern / Israeli cuisine. I'm sure you all are familiar with some of those books. We'll look at them in a second, but they're books that really look at what's happening in the Middle East and in Israel, and kind of the exciting food that is happening there, which, as we now know, goes way beyond baba ganoush and way beyond falafel and all of these foods that were originally introduced by Israelis to America. So that's another category. And then the fourth is another continuation of sort of the regional or global Jewish books. So books that really delve into either one specific area or corner of Jewish cuisine, or look at Jewish cuisine as sort of this like global entity, which it is. And something you'll see as we scroll through some of these pictures is all of these books have accessible recipes. They're recipes that have been tested, which is not necessarily what I would say for some of these older books. Like they can be hard to use, some of the older books, but the standards were different in terms of how carefully recipes were tested. And you also will see full color photography, which is not something you saw in some of these earlier books. You'll see modern design, and you also will see that they're aimed at a broader audience. So that's the other big change, right? You're seeing books that are about Jewish cuisine, but are not necessarily just for Jewish communities. And that, to me, I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but that to me is like the most exciting thing that's happening right now. Okay, so these are examples of some contemporary books. The most recent that just came out, I believe this season, is Modern Kosher. That's the one with the pink schmear and the falafel, like right in the center, by Michael Aaron Gardner. But we also see Millennial Kosher, which has a beautiful kind of pita taco situation happening on the cover. Very much not a Jewish dish, but made kosher. We see The Healthy Jewish Kitchen by Paula Scheuer, who's a friend of mine, and it's a gorgeous book of, again, finding ways to eat healthily within kosher cuisine. We have Modern Kosher, Global Flavors, New Traditions, and then we also have, I'm sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but The New Kosher by Kim Kushner. So all of these books are, again, a continuation of celebrating kosher cuisine and expanding what we think of when we think of kosher cuisine. Because a lot of people think kosher cuisine and Jewish cuisine are interchangeable, but that's not always the case. Okay, the next category is the one I was talking about, of taking traditional Jewish food and modernizing it. So my book is, again, Modern Jewish Cooking, and next to it is The Modern Jewish Baker. So those are books that have it in the title. We're taking old foods and we're making them relevant to the 21st century. And that's something that Jews have done throughout time, is taken traditional dishes and adapted them for, either where they were living or their contemporary times. And I love on The Modern Jewish Baker, the babka, they're all babka, but the babka in the middle, it has funfetti, it has sprinkles, it has, it's a very much not your bubby's babka. But I love that it sort of is still familiar, it's still recognizable as a babka. And that's something that you see happening, a lot with these books, is they have a through line to tradition. You can still look at my cover and see that there's lox on the cover and there's latkes, but underneath the latkes, instead of applesauce, there's an apple date chutney, right? So it's like taking something traditional and updating it. And one of the most recent examples that I love is this book, Eat Something, which was written by the people behind Wise Sons Delicatessen out in San Francisco. Maybe some of you have visited there and eaten there. So it's just a ridiculous cover, right? It is a chicken with juice dripping down this guy's farm, and it's in your face, and it's very much what you would imagine the physical embodiment of a bubby saying, eat your, you know, your skin and bones, like that. Like, it's literally eat something. And the interesting thing about this book is it is undeniably a Jewish book. You know, on every single page, there's, you know, Jewish humor and Jewish photos, and it begins with, you know, the bris and ends with a shiva, like it's every life cycle in between, and dishes for every life cycle. But it's not a fully kosher cookbook. You know, mine is, and I know many of the kind of modern Jewish books are, but this one is saying a book doesn't have to be 100% kosher to be Jewish. So I think that's a provocative. You know, I'm not going to say whether or not I agree with that. That's up for debate, and you can everyone can have their own opinion on that. But it is a provocative thing that you're seeing in some of these modern Jewish cookbooks today. It's kind of expanding what it means to what Jewish food can look like. Okay, so this is, as you can see, it's a bright, colorful page, and this is our page of modern Israeli and Middle Eastern books, and there are a lot of them, and they're all really great. So you have Sababa, which I have my copy here by my friend and colleague Adina Sussman, which came out last year and has made an absolute splash, which is awesome. And then you also have Jerusalem in the center, which was written, probably many of you have copies of this. This was written in 2012, I believe, and was a collaboration between Yotam Ottolenghi, who is a Israeli chef, and Sami Tamimi, who is a Palestinian chef, and the two of them worked together. I believe Tamimi was a sous chef at some of Ottolenghi's restaurants. They both now live in London, so they're kind of removed, and they wrote about their family's cuisines and their family's connections to Jerusalem. And it's just, it is, I kind of classify modern cooking today, and Jewish cooking in particular, as pre-Ottolenghi and post-Ottolenghi. Like, I feel like this book really changed the conversation and brought such an awareness about certain ingredients, like the Middle Eastern spice za'atar, or using preserved lemons, or using pomegranate molasses, or labna, the strained yogurt. It's really people's kind of lexicon of, or just awareness of Jewish food and Middle Eastern food kind of expanded from this book. And so some of these other ones, you see Zahav by Michael Solomonov, and Israeli Soul by Michael Solomonov, who's a chef in Philadelphia. And you see Shuk by Einat Admoni, who's a chef in Israeli chef living in New York. So that's kind of a really exciting part of what's going on. And then the last bit is what I was talking about, is sort of a continuation of that, really like delving into the global Jewish landscape. So my book, The Jewish Cookbook, which just came out last year, here I have it in the 3D form, you know, is one example of that. And it tries to capture recipes from Jewish communities from everywhere from Ethiopia to Morocco to, you know, Lithuania to India to Mexico City, anywhere and everywhere Jews have lived and eaten and celebrated. So that's one take. And then Joe Nathan's most recent book, King Solomon Table, does a similar thing. And then on the left, you see kind of the other end of that spectrum, which are people who really delve into one specific corner of Jewish cuisine. So you have Mama Nazima's Jewish Iraqi cuisine. I love that book. It's like kind of, there's nothing like it for Iraqi Jewish cuisine, so it's very, very special. Same with the German Jewish Cookbook, which came out a couple of years ago. And German Jewish cuisine is basically lost at this point because it was essentially wiped out with the Holocaust. And the German Jews who kind of moved to Manhattan acculturated enough that a lot of these dishes aren't eaten anymore. So this was written by a woman, Gabrielle, and her daughter Sonia. And Gabrielle was actually born in Germany and moved to Manhattan and lived in this very kind of German Jewish enclave on in the upper west side of Manhattan. And so it's really a gathering of recipes that otherwise might not make it to the next generation. So that's one of the amazing things that these books can do. And then the last one I just wanted to show you, this is called Spice and Kosher. It's exotic cuisine of the Cochin Jews. So it's one of India's Jewish communities. There are several, but it's the Jews who live along the Kerala, so along the coast. And it's just incredible. Like the dishes are unlike anything I grew up eating, but the context is the same, right? So it's very much a Jewish book, and it shows a completely different Jewish experience. And I love that these three folks just thought to go ahead and make that. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing for 1 second, and I want to ask Eileen. I could talk a little bit more about what it takes to write a Jewish cookbook, but I think I've talked a lot, and I would like to hear if there are some questions, and then we can go back and I can talk a little bit more about what it takes to write a Jewish cookbook, if there's interest in that as well. But
yes, so actually there was 3 questions that came through. I'm going to drop them in the chat now so you can see them.
okay.
And then some people had asked about certain recipes, one about sufganiyot, so I linked them to one that was from your book actually. So Brooke, if you can hear me, it's in the chat there for you.
Great. Do you want me to read questions, or do you want to just tell me some that you kind of, have you been scanning along? And
I'm going to read them. That way everyone in the room can hear them even if they're not on the chat. So one question was actually for you. So how old are your kiddos and do they cook with you?
So my son Max is 6 and my daughter Beatrice is 17 months. And not really. I can sometimes convince, Beatrice is too young, but I can sometimes convince Max to cook with me if I have a bowl of chocolate chips on the counter, but he's just not that into it, which is okay. He's got his own passions. He's a big baseball guy. And he likes to eat the challah that we make. So that's what really matters. Maybe someday.
That's awesome. So this one came in, actually, this was an email question from one of the attendees. When discussing Jewish cooking, cookbooks, and recipes, at what point does the reimagining take the recipe from a true Jewish cooking recipe to something that's altogether different? So at what point are they really changed where they would not maybe still be considered a Jewish recipe or Jewish cooking?
That's a great question. I think about that a lot when I'm developing my recipes, because it's so important for, if you're writing about a cuisine and a specific culture, that the recipe have a through line back to the tradition, right? You would want your grandmother or your great grandmother to at least recognize it, and that's kind of what I was talking about a little bit with the babka that had the sprinkles on it, right? Like the shape of the dough is a babka. The dough itself is a babka dough, but the filling gets a little bit, wild and crazy. So, that to me, as long as there's a connection that you can really point to and say, this is kind of the through line to the history and the tradition, I think it stays Jewish. But there are some recipes like that I've seen chefs do, like bacon wrapped matzo balls and things that I'm like, I don't care if people eat kosher or not. That's everybody's decision. But I guess to me, it's a matter of their intention, right? Like, are they doing it to make somebody laugh, and are they doing it to be kitschy, or are they doing it because they really want to explore a tradition and push boundaries? And so for me, the important thing is that a recipe connect back to its history, but also respect the tradition, right? Like, it doesn't mean you can't play. It doesn't mean that you can't get creative, but you want to respect what you're doing. And, maybe to that chef, like, that was an expression of that, but, to me, that may be like a step too far.
Awesome. I've got one more write-in question before we move on. And for legal questions, I won't say who this is in case their mom is on the call. My mom has tons of cookbooks, but she always uses the same recipes for every holiday. How would you convince your mom or someone cooking for many generations how to use a new recipe or try something new?
Well, I would suggest that the person who's writing it bring a recipe, bring a dish. I don't know, maybe that's not allowed. Maybe it's like mom does all the cooking. But for me, what I like to do is to have a few dishes on the table, often the main dishes that are like pretty traditional, like a pretty traditional brisket or a traditional roast chicken. or, you know, whatever, and then to play around with the side dishes, right? So maybe you do a different type of kugel. Maybe you bring in like a fresh interpretation of something. And so I feel like the sides, like the margins of the table, are much easier to infiltrate than like the main dish, because everyone gets really like, oh, there has to be matzo ball soup and whatever. And that's, you know, that's what makes holidays feel special. So it makes a lot of sense. But maybe this isn't the year to say this, since a lot of us will be having smaller meals, but I think adding to the table rather than replacing is a good way to do it. Does that make sense?
Awesome. I've got a few more questions that are coming in rapid fire, but I will, I believe one of our congregants sent one directly to you. Her name is Bonnie, and I think she sent it to you instead of to the room. Let me see if I can find her here. Actually, Bonnie, I'm just going to unmute you real quick, since I know you're a Zoom expert and you can ask away.
So, hi, Leah. Thank you so much. This is marvelous. I was the program director at the synagogue before Eileen, and we had an author by the name of Carla De Silva who put together a book called In Memory's Kitchen. And I wonder if you would speak to that rather than my describing it, because we were blown away by her and the story.
Is that the Holocaust cookbook?
Yes.
Okay,
right.
So I don't know it terribly well. I actually don't have it, and you're reminding me I'm going to order it like right after this call. But from what I understand, it was recipes pulled from either survivors, or was it written during when they were still in? You should describe it. Oh, but unmute yourself really quick.
Okay, so this a group of women who were in Terezin decided that they would write what they remembered from their recipes. As they became hungrier and more ill, you could tell that the handwritten recipes changed, both in terms of the writing and the accuracy. The story of it, mind you, this is 25 years ago that we brought her. The story is that the cookbook got given to a younger person with the idea that maybe that person would survive. That person went to Israel. 25 years later, 30 years later, someone brought it to the daughter of someone in the camp. She had survived because she was sent away. And on her doorstep appears her mother and other women's recipes. Wow. It was just an extraordinary story. I recommend that people just read about it, even if you don't get the book.
Thank you for bringing that up, and I definitely need to read it more carefully. And to me, it's such a testament to the power of food to connect us, and the power of food to lift us out of the most horrible, unspeakable moment that you could possibly imagine. So yeah, I wouldn't say that book necessarily falls within the categories. That's very much an outlier, but I'm so glad it exists.
There was one more question about a fellow author. It says, can you comment on Paula Wolfert as a cookbook writer? I don't know.
Yeah, she's wonderful. I don't know if there's a specific question. Yeah, I would say like this presentation that I am offering to you is not by any means the be all end all of all the Jewish cookbooks authors out there in the world. There's also, I think I saw people mentioning Noreen Gillitz, who unfortunately passed away recently, but was sort of the Joe Nathan of Toronto, or like the doyen of Jewish cuisine in Toronto. And there's people who are writing, there's Joyce Goldstein out in San Francisco who wrote books about Mediterranean Jewish food. There's so many people who've done it, and it's because Jewish food is so global that there's just endless stories to tell, and there's endless kind of entry points. So I was trying to sort of give broad strokes of sort of how the Jewish cookbook changed, and from sort of these instructional manuals from one group of immigrants to another to what they are today. So there's so many people that I couldn't include, and just, you know, go on Amazon or go to your local bookstore and just search the Jewish cookbook aisles, because there's so much.
Well, I see a couple trickling in, but I know people are asking and are eager to hear about your cookbook process and a couple other things, so I'll let you speak to that.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go back to my silly notes. Okay, so I've written 6 different cookbooks. My first one was a collaboration with Hadassah, the Hadassah Everyday Cookbook. It was came out in 2011, and then my most recent one is this one, the Jewish Cookbook, which is a 400 recipe collection of global Jewish cuisine. So along the way, I have sort of come up with my process of how you write a Jewish cookbook, and it may be different from what other people do, but I kind of wanted to talk just a little bit about what goes into it. Obviously, the first step is gathering the recipes. And for me, I do that in several different ways. You know, one is I try to cook with as many people as possible. Obviously, that's a lot harder right now during COVID times, but when I was researching this book, if I was ever traveling somewhere, I would try to connect with somebody Jewish in the community and cook with them. So one of my favorite examples is I did a cooking demonstration in Seattle, and there's an amazing Sephardic community there. They're Turkish and Greek, I believe, and at the Isle of Rhodes. So it's like 3 different Jewish communities, Sephardic communities, and they all bake together. There are these the 2 different Sephardic synagogues in Seattle have baking groups, and it's these women get together, and a few men also, and they'll kibitz, and they'll, you know, make barekas and bizcocho and like all of these different Sephardic pastries. And I got a chance to cook with them, and it was just like a highlight of my life. So that's one way I gather research and recipes. Another way is I use my social networks, and I say, you know, hey, a friend of mine whose family is Persian, like, what is on your family's Rosh Hashanah table? What is on your family's Passover table? And I really try to make sure that I'm not necessarily asking for specific recipes, but I am asking for dishes to make sure I get everything. And then, you know, my own cookbook collection is just growing and growing and growing all the time, because it's the best way to find the corners of Jewish cuisine that you may not have thought about. Is by reading old cookbooks. So the first thing you do is you gather your recipes, and then you usually end up with a list of recipes or dishes that is way longer than you could possibly include. So you start to think, like, do I really need like 6 kugel recipes, or maybe I only need 4? Or, you know, can I get away with 1 matzo ball, or do I need to have a sinker and a floater? You know, all of those kind of fun and often heartbreaking conversations with yourself. And then the recipe development, I feel like I spoke to this from the question that came up about balancing tradition and innovation. So, for example, my mom privately messaged me to mention savory hamantaschen. So I came up with a couple of recipes for modern Jewish cooking that say, why does hamantaschen have to be sweet, right? Just because they were originally made with ground poppy seeds or jam, they're essentially the same thing as like an empanada, or like, you know, any kind of pastry that has like a filling. So I came up with 2 different ones. One was a butternut squash and Parmesan hamantaschen, and I changed the dough a little so it was a less sweet, and it had some dried herbs in the dough. And then I came up with another one that was like a ground beef and pine nut kind of tomato raisin Sephardic situation. And they're really delicious. And, you know, they're still hamantaschen. They still have the triangular shape, and they're folded the same way and baked the same way, but they have something a little different going on. And then the last thing that you do when you're working on a book is, you know, you have your recipes, but for me, this is not my quote, so I'm not going to take credit for it, but a friend of mine says, recipes without recipes without stories are just calories. And that's not entirely true. Like, a good meal can transcend whether or not there's a story involved. But to me, having like an introduction, having sidebars that tell you more information, having head notes, which is the text on top of a recipe that just kind of places it into context, where it was from, when it was from, where people ate it, why people ate it. That to me kind of rounds out your book and makes it more of a meal than a snack, if you're going with that metaphor. And then I also just wanted to show a few sample dishes from some of my books that kind of illustrate what I've been talking about with tradition and innovation. So on the left of the screen, in the bowl, I have a smoky sweet potato hummus. That's from my little book of Jewish appetizers with Chronicle Books. And it's very much a traditional hummus. It has chickpeas and tahini and olive oil and garlic and all of the kind of things you would expect in hummus, but it adds roasted mashed sweet potato and a little bit of smoked paprika. And it really just kind of takes hummus and brings it to a different flavor place flavor-wise. So that's one example. The black and white cookies that you see on the bottom of the page, black and white cookies are a New York City Jewish bakery staple and now popular throughout the country. So these are a mocha version from the Little Book of Jewish Sweets, another book of mine. And so they're basically a regular black and white cookie, but the dough has brewed coffee and a little bit of espresso powder, I think. And then the black side of the frosting also has espresso powder. And it just kind of brings it to a different, unexpected place, but very much is still a black and white cookie. On the top, there's a apple butter and apple challah, which would be very apropos for Rosh Hashanah coming up. On the bottom, there's a schnitzel. It's a chicken schnitzel, but it's seeded with, it's kind of like an everything bagel, I think. Or maybe it's just sesame and poppy seeds, but it has kind of seeds in it, which looks extra crunch and extra flavor and nuttiness to the topping. And then on the top right, there's a raspberry chocolate babka that's painted with fresh raspberry syrup and has raspberry jam. It's really, really delicious, very decadent. And then the bottom right is sort of a green shakshuka, which is not necessarily my invention. There's lots of green shakshuka recipes out there, but it's just, I love how it kind of turns this dish that's become really popular on its head a little bit. So yeah, so we have about 10 minutes until 11:30, so I'd be more than happy to answer more questions. And I also just wanted to put up my contact information, my website and my Instagram, and the names of my books. And I always love when people get in touch, and my contact info is on my website, leahkoenig.com. So yeah, Eileen, do you want to tell me if there's any other questions?
Yeah, so there were two that came in. One was about kind of the progression and the differences between cookbooks and online recipes and that kind of space. And then there was also a question, just to double it up, about specific dietary needs, allergies, preferences, dairy, eggs, celiac. So that's kind of a twofer, but there you go.
Sure. So I'll answer the second one first. So there are so many dietary needs that I would say traditional Jewish cooking doesn't address very well, especially Ashkenazi cuisine. So, if you have celiac, it can be hard to engage with traditional Ashkenazi food because so much of it has flour. Same goes with dairy. If you are dairy free, there are a lot of parve desserts, but you're missing out on a lot of stuff. So it can be hard. However, same with vegan. Obviously, like you can't go to a deli and get very much if you're vegan. But there are a couple of cookbooks out there that speak to that exact thing. So there's one, I'm going to forget the names, but if you Google like gluten-free kosher or gluten-free Jewish or something, you'll come up with these books of people who have done the legwork to make recipes that actually kind of mimic or honor the traditional recipes, but also are good for dietary restraints. And then, you know, if you like to play around in your kitchen, you can always, you know, take a recipe and kind of try to, you know, swap out some, a 1-for-1 gluten-free flour, and maybe the cookie will work great. Often it does. You know, you can kind of always take recipes and try to modify them a little bit. And then in terms of internet versus cookbooks, so I think back when the internet was kind of first getting started, right? Like you couldn't really trust a lot of recipes from the internet because, you know, people were just kind of throwing everything up there. I think now, especially if you're looking at a place like, you know, Food and Wine's website, or Food 52 or Saveur, or some of the websites of more established publications, you know that someone has been testing those recipes. And you know that they are reliable. So there's more good content on the web than there used to be. One hint to know that the person is not a professional recipe tester, and if you see their recipe, is that in a professionally tested and developed recipe, the ingredient list will show up in the same order that the ingredients are used in the instructions, right? So if it's like beat eggs and sugar together, the ingredient list will say eggs followed by sugar. If you see ingredients kind of everywhere and they don't bear any resemblance to where they show up, you know that it's not a professionally tested recipe. So that's just a little hack. But what, you know, when you're talking about a published book, to me, like I use a lot of recipes from the internet. I'll be like, oh, I have kale. Let me just like Google a recipe and find something. But for me, recipe collections and books are still so important because someone took the time, and I'm not just saying that because I'm biased because I write books, but somebody took the time to think about why they wanted a particular set of recipes in a particular book. And they did the work and they did the research, and they kind of are bringing you on a journey in a way that instead of taking you down a rabbit hole, right? When you go onto the internet, you go down rabbit holes. When you go into books, you go into somebody's thought process. And so I think that's what makes books still really worthwhile, not as a replacement for the internet, but as a side-by-side companion. And also you hope that if something's published in a book, it's been tested a bunch of times. That's not always the case, but often it is. So I would say they are generally more reliable than the web.
That is awesome, and we are running so close to time. Let me ask, I'm just doing some scrolls through. So for people that want to find your books, want to find your recipes, they can order them from your website, online. And then where else can we see you? Also, when you are traveling again for stuff, we really hope to host you here in San Diego because we do miss you out here. Is there any other closing words that you want to share with us? Because I do want to also, I think Julie's also going to send us off with some info as well about our Women of Beth Israel and who hosted tonight's program.
I would just end by, first of all, saying thank you so much for having me. I mean, traveling as a cookbook author and doing cooking demos and cookbook talks and things like that in person has been a huge part of my work, and it's been one of my favorite parts of my work. And when this pandemic first started, I was really, really heartbroken and a little panicky that part wasn't going to continue. And I've been really humbled and just really grateful that I feel like some of the cooking that I do or the talks can really translate over the screen. And I always appreciate people's questions. So I guess I would say that. And the other thing I would say is, Rosh Hashanah is coming up, and like Passover, it's going to look really, really different this year for a lot of us. It's going to be smaller. It might be outside rather than around our dining room tables. It might be just, our nuclear families or a few other pod families. And, there's room this year for joy, and there's room this year for grief. And I think both are okay. And I think the answer to both is food, right? Like, we can still cook, and we can still make meaning, and we can still connect, even though things are different this year. So I guess I would just end with a bracha or a blessing that we all find moments of connection, even in this very strange year.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was absolutely incredible. So on behalf of Women of Beth Israel, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight's event. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to Leah Koenig for a wonderful presentation, Eileen Tatro for coordinating the event, and my co-chair Marge Shane for her help and support. Upcoming Women's Rosh Chodesh events are as follows. Sunday, October 18th, 7 to 8 p.m. will be Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, Women in Style featuring Jessica Kretzer. Sunday, November 15th, 7 to 8 p.m. will be Rosh Chodesh Kislev, which will be on women's health. And Wednesday, December 16th, 7 to 8 p.m. will be Rosh Chodesh Tevet, featuring Rabbi Lenore Bohm. These will all be sent out to you by email, and they'll all be on Beth Israel's website. L'Shana Tova to everyone. Have a very sweet new year, and again, a huge thank you to Leah Koenig.